All right, we're back at it. Our next topic is resistance. And again, you can see where we just came from a moment ago. We were talking about potential difference. So resistance is, again, what I would like to say straightforward. It's basically talking about the opposition to current or the resistance to current. The chapter here has two different types that they talk about, conductance and admittance. I'm not concerned about that. So we can kind of just gloss right over those two terms. Don't get too hung up on either one of them. But what's more important is these factors right here. So we're talking about electrical resistance, depending on four things: materials conductivity, length, diameter, and temperature. So let's talk about that. And before we go too much further, again, if you're following along in the chapter, you can see where we left off a moment ago with potential difference. And if you move forward, then it gets into resistance on page 43. Now, if you notice the stuff that we've been talking about, we have a paragraph, but this one right here, it actually spans across a couple of pages. So make sure, and it stops here at Ohm's law. So make sure, sorry, get that out of there. Make sure that you do go through and read the chapter. Like I said, hopefully I'll demystify it a little bit with this video. But if you do have more questions, you can always reach out, but also look back in the chapter. There's some good stuff in there. So with that being said, let's talk about resistance. And while not a perfect analogy, you can see I have, was it Sisyphus, I think was the Greek god here. And you can see there's a tremendous amount of resistance as he's pushing the boulder up the hill. But enough of that. Let's get in here. A couple things, and we're going to get into this, but resistance does have a unit of measure, and it's the ohm. I believe the next place, if you just saw a sneak peek in our textbook, I think the next thing that we're going to be talking about is Ohm's law, but that's video will be to come. But what are things that add to or influence resistance of current flow in a conductor? Well, one of the things, I guess the first thing on the list, is simply the material's conductivity. Now, we spoke about this before, specifically about the valence band and the conduction band. And if you remember, we talked a little bit about the difference between an insulator, a semiconductor, and a conductor as far as where that conduction band lies in relation to the valence band. So if we start here with an insulator, you can see that the valence band and the conduction band, there's a decent amount of separation. Now, just a little recap. Valence simply means the outermost shell of electrons. And when we're talking about the conduction band, that's the area where there's loosely bound electrons freely flow. So in an insulator, they're a little too far apart to really permit electron flow. So that's one thing that obviously can lead to resistance if it can't move because the conduction band's too far out of range. If we go up the line here, you can see with a semiconductor, they're a little bit closer together. And typically with semiconductors, there are certain situations where electrons flow freely, and there are other situations where electrons don't flow at all. And those are typically introduced with different materials or different stuff that we do to permit electron flow or not. So that's a semiconductor. And then with conductors, you can see there's actually an overlap between the conduction band and the valence band. So out of those three, we can say that the resistance is highest in an insulator and lowest in a conductor. So if we go back, so that's basically an explanation of the first thing that resistance is dependent on, which is the material's conductivity. The second thing is the length of the conductor. So if we go back here, again, I'm going to use a water analogy. If we look at here, think about if we actually had all that hose put together, how much water pressure you would need to get the same amount of flow out of a hose that's only that long right there. So with that being said, as the length of the conductor increases, the resistance also increases. So in that case, it's a direct relationship. And again, if you just think about it with pressure, how much water pressure would you need to get a strong stream to come out of a hose that length? Apply that same concept to a hose this length, and like I said, because there's so much less resistance, it'll be much more forceful using the same pressure in this hose as it is in this hose. So that's the role that the length of the conductor plays. Next, let's talk about the role that the diameter plays. So we scroll down a little bit, and the idea is here you can see that there's larger diameter there, smaller diameter there, big diameter, small diameter. So with that being said, the smaller the diameter, there's more resistance. So in other words, not as much water can flow. And again, we're using a water analogy, but what we're really talking about is electron flow or current. But sorry, as the diameter gets bigger, there's less resistance, which permits more current to flow. So again, as the diameter gets smaller, the diameter goes down, resistance goes up. But as the diameter goes up, resistance goes down. So with this one, you can say it's an inverse relationship. And then finally, let's talk temperature. So temperature plays a role. If you remember we talked before, I asked the question, I said, well, what is heat? And what heat is, it's basically all these little electrons vibrating around. As the heat goes up and up and up, the vibration continues to get higher and higher and higher. So as the temperature goes up, what happens is the electrons start to have more and more collisions. And more collisions increases the resistance to flow. So again, we can say, what is temperature's relationship with resistance? You can say as the temperature goes up, resistance also goes up because more and more collisions take place at the subatomic level. So I guess with that one, we can also say it's a direct relationship. And when we talk about things like, we talked up here about conductors, semiconductors, conductors. What's not listed on here is superconductors. And they'd be like a tier or two higher than this one. And superconductors, when they operate them, they're operated at extremely cold temperatures to overcome limitations like this. So, with that being said, let's see. Those are the 4 factors that influence resistance. And just like the other one, I have a couple of critical thinking. 2 critical thinking questions to go along with this. So what I want you to do is refer to the diagram below. And there's 4 wires. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4. And you can see that there are different configurations. I think the A means aperture, I think. Aperture is basically a hole. So in this case, the diameter there and there is equal, but you can see the difference here, it's twice as wide. And then if you go here, we have L for length, and you can say the length here and here is equal, but here and here is twice as long. So using the principles here that we just talked about, out of the 4 wires, which one has the least resistance and which one has the most? And then, of course, don't forget, explain why.